This particular occasion has been organized around the theme Vedanta, Samkhya and Patanjala Darsana. This is, of course, a very important focus for the assembly to have. I am taking an untrodden path in bringing linguistics or grammar into it. And even if you don't have the advantage of having the handout in front of you, I can still introduce some of the basic ideas. The coupling of yoga and grammar or linguistics is rather odd. It's not normally done even in scholarly academic literature. But as we go on, you will be able to see why it can take place in the Indian tradition and why India is the only country where such coupling of different ways of looking at human condition can take place. In Sanskrit, the term used very commonly for covering grammar as well as linguistics is Vyakarana. Vyakarana is somewhere in between or includes both and something beyond, depends on which area of grammar you are most interested in. But it's not exactly 100% like what the English word grammar covers. It's not exactly like linguistics that in modern life covers. However, there is no disagreement among scholars that Vyakarana is one of the most impressive achievements of ancient India. It has mesmerized people. There are scholars all over the world, relatively few in number, but who dedicate their lives to the study of Sanskrit Vyakarana. Some of the achievements of ancient Indian Vyakarana tradition are truly amazing, particularly those who enter the field even after superficial acquaintance get to understand that Vyakarana is treated as some kind of sacred discipline, some kind of amazing instrument to shape individual and social lives. It is a sacred object, unlike in many other countries in the Indian tradition. The refinement of grammatical coverage, grammatical technique, the descriptive mechanism has amazed for last 200 years at least a number of scholars even from outside India. In the study of Sanskrit in relation to those European languages, especially European classical languages, which are similar to Sanskrit, grammar has played a very important role. For example, the Indian grammatical tradition reduced nouns, adjectives, and several other types of words to verbal roots. The shabdas were reduced to dhatus. And this idea of a dhatu as forming the seed out of which language blossoms, language becomes an all-encompassing tree, is India's gift to the linguistic tradition over the world. The Greek tradition was rather unorganized in dealing with language. They had some insights. They were also amazed by the phenomenon of language. They tried to compose grammars, but the consistency of ideas and this insight that we can reduce most of the words of a language to verbal roots, that the Greeks did not have. And so historically, in late 18th and early 19th century, the European tradition was amazed by what the Indian tradition had achieved. And so they began to study the roots also. There were other incidental advantages as well. Jumping over about 200 years, we come to the descriptive techniques of Sanskrit grammarians. And around 1960s, the idea of a generative grammar, the idea of writing grammatical rules as essentially transformation rules, caught on in the Western academic world. Normally, the credit for the popularity of this approach is given to Noam Chomsky, who was a professor, maybe he still is, in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he proposed this approach to writing grammars. The approach mainly consisted in writing grammatical rules in such a way that they will be applied in a particular sequence. And this sequence will be an automated sequence. It's not automated in the sense right away as machine doing it, but thinking of a grammarian's mind as being aware of the order of rules and of making rules applicable in a certain sequence, certain order only. And it was seen that there will be considerable brevity for grammatical rules if they are ordered and if they follow each other as if it was an automation. The second idea was that a grammarian should think of language as consisting of an infinite number of sentences. And although we may occasionally think that the same sentences are used in a language, maybe because we hear expressions like thank you, please, again and again, that the same sentences keep on repeating. But a little reflection would convince us that language is infinite number of sentences. And we are, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not, we are creative almost every moment when we use a language. For example, the sentences I am uttering right now, I have never uttered before. Probably you have never heard them at any time. Still, we understand. And so, this idea of infinite number of sentences, orderly nature of rules, that was the main basis for generative grammar. Language is generating new sentences all the time. And so the rules must be written in such a way that if rule A1 transforms a particular string in a specific way, rule A2 should work on that sequence, that theme, automatically. And then it should keep on doing it. And when it comes to a stage where it cannot apply itself to a string, the grammatical operation, the descriptive machine stops. So this was a revolutionary idea, and you can see how close it is to computational techniques. That is, computers are supposed to work in precisely the same way, that as soon as one string is presented to the computer, it should think of what other strings could be applicable. And if it doesn't find any applicable string, it would stop. Otherwise, it would continue on pointing out at least different possibilities. So it was no coincidence that after the seed of generative linguistics was planted, immediately computer scientists were also attracted to it. And then they began to see that Panini's grammar really works like a computer. And this he must have written roughly about 3,000 years ago. So the achievement of the Indian tradition was simply unbelievable. It was so much ahead of its time. And that created an interest in language. It's a long history, and one of the most remarkable things is that this tradition of grammar is one of the few Indian traditions that still is living. We may not understand this, especially in Maharashtra. It's very common to look down upon all these things as old-fashioned and not really of any use to us, but actually we all should here try to dispel this kind of misconception. And these things are way ahead of their time, in fact. They are not only backward and outdated and something we should really not think about, but we should really try to see how they are related to this life, how this tradition can continue. But that would be another topic, so I will not get into that very much. Now, this kind of study of grammar continues. That was one thing that was very attractive to specialists of Indo-European languages, that was very attractive to theoretical linguists, and we have some of the rare scholars in the world who are really working on this interface, this borderline between modern linguistics and Sanskrit grammar. So it's not like a typical English grammar. Many of you older people here might have been brought up on grammars such as Wren and Martin and so on, where the idea was you give sets of words, you give general rules, and then you leave it to the person to learn the language on the basis of whatever she or he hears. That's how we normally worked. That approach has its own merits, but Sanskrit was a different kind of treatment altogether of language, and it naturally amazed people. But you will see this is continuing. Some of the rare scholars, for example, Paul Kiparsky at University of Stanford. He is one of the relatively young. Now he must be in his 50s, 60s, so, but in academic terms he's still a bacha. So he is one who would, he works precisely on this. That is, he came to linguistics, theoretical linguistics, generative linguistics, and then he was attracted to Panini and he became one of the best specialists of Paninian grammar. You have persons other than Professor George Cardona, who is also working mostly on the formal side of Panini's grammar, and Madhav Deshpande from University of Pune, but later on University of Pennsylvania. All these people are attracted to different aspects of the amazing technique and descriptive validity of Panini. There is another, however, another side to the Sanskrit grammar's Vyakarana tradition, which is not found in modern linguistics. That's why I said Vyakarana is on the borderline of traditional Western grammar and what has now become traditional Western linguistics. This side is to think about language itself. And some of the Indian engagement with language as a very unavoidable part of human life, but also an amazing part of human life. And that interest in language you see right from Vedic times. It's very unusual for the scriptural literature of other parts of the world to be interested in language in a philosophical way. As some sort of phenomenon that touches our being in a very direct way. And philosophers in the 20th century began to discuss language and philosophizing, relationship between language and thought, even in the Western world. But in India, the concern with language as some kind of reflection, as some kind of mirror of what we are, how we behave, how our thought world, how our creativity is determined by language. That engagement is very, very old, impressively old. And even the Veda has a special hymn dedicated. The oldest, what is normally considered to be the oldest Veda, the Rig Veda, has a whole hymn dedicated to Vach. And Vach there speaks of itself as controlling even the other divine figures in the Vedic pantheon, in the Vedic world. And it also, we have some verses in the first mandala of the Rig Veda where there is talk of 4 phases or 4 levels or 4 aspects of language, Chatvari Shringa Trayo Asya Pada, etc., which pose as sort of riddles, but the tradition has preserved the answers to those riddles as well. Now, this is the second half of the Indian grammatical tradition. We see it slowly developing from the earliest Vedic Samhitas into the Brahmanas, then the Upanishads, but a clear interest in these topics is to be found in the Nirukta and the Mahabhashya of Patanjali. They also are not concerned exclusively with this phenomenon, but they know its relevance, and they make a few remarks which are historically very important and revealing. In Patanjali's Mahabhashya, the questions of the nature of language have been asked with the frame of grammatical description in mind, and with Panini's grammar as the frame. This also led to a fusion of these two traditions, the free thinking in Vedic literature and the relatively restricted thinking in Mahabhashya, Nirukta, etc. And the fusion gave rise to an amazing philosopher, Bhartrhari, roughly in the 3rd, 4th century AD, or maybe even earlier. All these dates, by the way, are tentative, and I'm not going to spend time on chronology, although I work on that aspect quite a lot. The figure of Bhartrhari recaptures a lot of ancient thinking, the thinking of which direct texts have been lost to us, but were known to Bhartrhari. He summarizes them, he refers to their views as occasions arise, and he now writes something that of which we see glimpses in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, and we actually find an elaboration in Bhartrhari, although a great deal of very important literature is unfortunately lost to us. Bhartrhari speaks of the 4 phases or levels of language, which I will explain to you in a very simple way, and you will immediately see how it can bring us closer to yoga from this side of language. What you are hearing is the phonetic or sound aspect of language. You hear my words, they come out in a specific sequence. I have to observe the boundaries within which my pronunciation takes place. If I go too far away from the distinctive sounds of the language, you will not understand me. Then I have to observe a particular space between words. If I speak words without any gap, you will not understand. So just as sounds have a role to play, the gaps left between sounds have a role to play. And the sequence is the characterizing feature of this first level of language. We will call it language 1. And all languages have that there's no doubt about it. This is called Vaikhari in Sanskrit. Then the second stage is, with very little reflection, it becomes obvious to us. We normally think that thought comes before the utterance. Sometimes very disappointed, we will say, why didn't that person think before he said something? But that's where thinking acquires a slightly different sense, that the appropriateness of thought or inappropriateness. But generally, even in reconstructing, we say there must have been a mental counterpart of what is said. Even if we don't right away think of it, if we sit down to discuss someone's speech, we have to make the assumption that the sentence exists somewhere in a more stable form than the form we heard in sound. So sound is characterized by sequence. The sound form of language is also characterized by perishability. It disappears in thin air after a while. But in some abstract form, the sentence, the language stays with us. That storehouse of sentences that are uttered, that have a mental existence, that is Madhyama, the middle stage of language. Let's call it language 2. Then we have language 3, because we are reasonably sure that what we said was made of several words, sentences, clauses, phrases, etc. And they are not going to disappear simply because we stopped talking, or we slept, or we rested. we have a command of the language, we say. And command consists in recalling the units of language when we need it. And as I said, with the same, even if we assume that all these units of language are individually different, we can still come up with new sentences all the time. And even with a limited vocabulary, we can coin unlimited number of sentences. So we have to assume a third form of language, third phase or level of language, in which language is stored in the form of the whole utterances, the whole text, or the dismantled components of the sentences, clauses, compositions, etc. that we have heard. And those components help us in creating new sentences. That is called pashyanti. The language which is viewing, witnessing the capabilities that have been given to us in the form of dismantled, separate, discrete units. To explain all these three, we have to assume that we have a basic language capability. That is, unless we theoretically assume that there is a fundamental power, some fundamental strength in us of some sort, abstract sort, that enables us to come up, learn this language, to speak, we will not be able to explain the other three. We may never see this fourth phase, fourth level of language in abstraction ourselves. But we have to assume it. And we have to assume that there is a form of language which is devoid of all the diversity I have spoken of so far, but which is capable of assuming the form of all that diversity. And so if I am speaking Malayalam, then of course I will have a language capability particularly geared toward Malayalam. If I am speaking Sanskrit, I have a capability particularly dedicated to Sanskrit. But I am capable of doing that, and I am capable of mixing all of these things. So that's the fourth level. Now you will see here, these four levels have an uncanny similarity, what we are normally taught in Vedanta. The Jagrat Avastha, the Swapnavastha, Sushupti Avastha, and a fourth stage. So we have a four-layered structure on one side in the form of language, and you have a four-layered structure on Vedanta. And the close relationship of Vedanta and yoga is known to us. In yoga, sometimes we may speak of nidra as a vritti, the five vrittis. They may be five in number, but frequently what they achieve, the role we assign to them in theorizing about our life, is pretty similar to what the grammarian does with the four phases of language. And so a grammarian can say that treat my language 3, pashyanti, just as you would treat mind or buddhi, intellect, on your side. Treat my language 4, pashyanti, as you would treat jivatman or something abstract, or a paramatman in the form of reflection or in the form of limitation, whether pratibimbavada or avachedakavada. That will be a separate matter for discussion. But the relationship you will now clearly see. Now you may say, but this is the sort of similarity we moderns have imagined after knowing Vedanta, after we have studied the text like Bhartrhari's text. And we are seeing similarity as scholars. We have the advantage of looking at ancient literature and seeing parallelisms, and we can meaningfully raise questions such as who inspired whom and so on. But is there something beyond that, where these people are aware of the relevance of thinking about language, relevance of philosophizing about language with something like yoga? And that would still remain a question. Do we have evidence directly from them? And the evidence consists in the form of a very interesting expression that is found in Bhartrhari's text called Shabda Purva Yoga. The word yoga is used there, but it's qualified with Shabda Purva. yoga preceded by yoga, shabda. Okay, shabda purva. Unfortunately, we have not found in ancient literature so far a consistent kind of description, account, theorizing about this Shabda Purva Yoga. That is, I have not come across a text where the phenomenon of Shabda Purva Yoga would be analyzed. Just like the phenomenon of yoga is analyzed, you will have yama, niyama, etc. on one side, you will have the vrittis on the other side. That kind of essay on Shabda Purva Yoga from an ancient author is missing. Modern scholars are, of course, trying to find out what is involved. Sometimes they have misunderstood, but we can still, with little information and textual remarks that are available, we can still see that Shabda Purva Yoga has a close parallel in Vedanta. The words are different, but just as in Vedanta it is said, you have a Jivatman, which is, in most schools of Vedanta, it will be said, it's pure, it's clean, it's not defiled by worldly associations, it is unity, it's not diversity, it creates a calmness of mind, it gives you an ability to see something beyond what we normally see and think about. In the same way, Shabda Purva Yoga is treated as equivalent of Shamadamadi Sadhana Sampat. This is why is Vedanta interested in Shamadamadi? Why is yoga interested in Sanyama? The terminology differs, but the central function is similar. And so, it will be said that just with Shama, Dhamma, what we do is we achieve a cleansing of the mind. And that cleansing enables us to get a reflection of some higher reality, enables us to proceed further, to be spiritual, to be adhyatmic, to be a yogin, and so on. So, on the worldly level, academic level, scholarly level, we can use different terminologies, but the function associated with Shabda Purva Yoga is similar to what the function associated with Shamadamadi Sadhana Sampat. The grammarian will, of course, speak in a restricted way. And so the accounts of Shabda Purva say that if someone speaks grammatically, preceded by knowledge of grammar, so someone invests energy and time in studying grammar, that is like tapascharya. That is like tapas. And that tapas, of course, consists of shama dhamma, as you will see. So, that Shabda Purva Yoga is preceded by this kind of restrained behavior for dedicated focus on something and so on. So that serves to cleanse our mind, that serves to increase the abilities of our mind. Let's say, roughly speaking, it gives a kind of siddhi that we did not have before. So that is what is Shabda Purva Yoga doing on the one hand. And secondly, this the discipline a person inculcates to speak with grammatical expressions is not just a matter of gaining social respectability. In modern ways, we say if someone speaks Oxford English, that person has a better chance of getting a good job. So we tie the worldly success with grammatical speech, with educated speech, with impressive speech, with socially more acceptable speech, and so on. And that is covered by, in Sanskrit, by grammarians as abhyudaya. So with study of grammar, you can have abhyudaya, worldly gains, those are not denied. But if that study of grammar, if that practice in grammatical speech is preceded by a kind of detached study for the sake of knowledge, interest in grammar and philosophy just because we want to enlighten ourselves, are not seeking any worldly gain, then it is abhyudaya as well as brahma prapti. Okay? So this final form of language, pashyanti, at a higher level, that is called also Parabrahman. That's the Brahman of the grammarians. So you'll see, starting from the Vedas, slowly the ideas were discussed, and in Bhartrihari we get at least this much. And that's where grammar and yoga come very close, obviously. So, although in the title of this conference there is no inclusion of grammar, you will see we will be perfectly justified to include grammar as another intellectual tradition of India that gives us a context, that gives us a frame to understand yoga in a better way, in a more expanded way. And that can be easily included in yogic practice. A grammarian can become a yogin in that way. So that is one part of how yoga and Vyakarana are related. The other part is more mundane but historically important. The author I am interested in, Bhartrhari on the one hand, and the second author on whom I am going to touch, that is Yoga Bhashya. That Yoga Bhashya and Bhartrhari's work and the Yoga Bhashya have many textual similarities. This is philological side of the relation I am talking about. This is the language-based actual historical evidence for the two intellectual traditions of ancient India, yoga and grammar, this is the evidence of their actual interaction with each other. And in what I'm going to present today has developed over several decades. I'm trying to give it to you in as simple a form as possible. For about three decades, I was held up in this research because I couldn't see a historically and methodologically defensible way out of the problems I found. In 1970, I read a paper pointing out the similarities, textual similarities between the Yoga Bhashya and the Vakyapadi or Trikandi Bhartrhari's work to the extent it survives. And the similarities were similarities of expression, similarities of analogies or drishtantas, similarities of thought. There were similarities of thought and expression. So, and also the commentators of Bhartrhari wrote as if they presumed Bhartrhari to have a knowledge of yoga. This is how it was quite clear. Now, in popular tradition, Bhartrhari is very well known as a yogin. We don't have much actual, what we would call solid historical information about it, but the popular image is Bhartrhari was a disciple of Matsyendranath, and you will have a play written in Sanskrit called Bhartrhari Nirveda, where Bhartrhari is getting disenchanted with worldly life is described. We have several stories in which local associations, for example, if you go to Ujjain, there is Bhartrhari's cave in the Mahakaleshwar temple where he is said to be meditating, or that was his favorite spot where he sat as a yogi. And one of the things I did not know, I was just once traveling from traveling to Jaipur, and there is a place called Bairat in Rajasthan. And that they think that Bhartrhari as a yogin has his final liberation in that place. So they have a little temple of Bhartrhari and a strong local tradition. So Bhartrhari in the popular imagination also has been associated with yoga. That's a third strand in what I'm trying to do in terms of placing Bhartrhari in the yoga tradition. Is this much so far clear? Yes. Am I making sense? Yes. Okay. Now let's get into some deeper waters. As I said, there are similarities of expression and thought. And I have a long list which I wanted to present to some of you at least. But do we have the handouts now in here? No? That's okay. For example, analogies such as this, that Jaya and Parajaya is actually achieved by a king's soldiers. But the credit goes to the king. So, similarly, it is said that whatever, don't worry about not having it, so we'll go ahead. Okay. Sorry, there was a misunderstanding. I was told I have 45 minutes, but that's okay. That's fine. Now, I'll skip over all these technical details, but there is one paragraph that is very important. This is the exact wording which is found in the Yoga Bhashya. And this is where my sort of mental block, my greatest difficulty for nearly 30 years occurred. In the case of all other similarities, I could easily say, comfortably say, that the two works knew each other either directly or through a third source. That was quite clear. But which one was earlier, which one was later? Even after a great deal of analysis of the terminologies, the passages, I could not really see a clinching piece of evidence to declare which was the earlier text and from which Bhartrihari could have borrowed, or if Bhartrihari was earlier, the Yoga Bhashya could have borrowed. So this was the problem. And in particular, there was one passage occurring in the 31st verse of the second book of Bhartrihari's Vakyapadiya, where he refers to the thought that ultimately word and meaning are the same thing. Meaning, we normally think in terms of things outside, we then say images of things outside, and we may ultimately say that image is, because image is mental, meanings are mental, whereas words have some kind of unique physical reality, they are heard. Sound is a very different kind of physical substance. Definitely, because we grasp it with senses, we must call it physical, but unlike other physical objects, sound is fleeting. If a pot or cloth is made of stable components, sound is made of components that appear for a moment and disappear. And still we have a feeling of unity, of a word, sentence, and so on. So that uniqueness of sound creates problems in associating it with meaning also. In Western tradition, the issue of meaning has been dominating discussions for a long time now, at least 60, 70 years. This is one of the major things for psychologists, linguists, philosophers, all of them. And now with consciousness coming into the foreground in the Vedic, in the Western way of thinking, this has assumed even greater importance. And the grammarian's philosophy is much more relevant now. Now, the ultimate view of the grammarian is that meaning is really not different from the sounds, from the words. If we look from one point of view, it's meaning, it's abstract, it's mental, it's Buddhist, intellectual, in some intellectual or intellectual. And if we look at it from the other side, the physical side, this sense side, sound is not the same thing. So we call it form, word form, but the meaning is ultimately associated with it. So Spota theory is associated with grammarians, and the essence of the Spota theory is that the same entity, when looked upon from the side of our actual sense experience, is linguistic form. And the same entity, when looked from the point of view of our consciousness, what figures in our mind and so on, then it's meaning. Why are the other alternatives not acceptable? Because not all words refer to external things. Sometimes the same external thing is reflected in different ways. The same peak we could call, looking at it from India or Nepal, we'll call it Gauri Shankar. We are looking at from another side, we may use the English term Mount Everest and so on. But the physical thing is the same. Are the meanings of Mount Everest and Gauri Shankar the same? No, because their associations are so different. Mount Everest would take us to the English period of Indian history and how life was dominated and how an English surveyor could have a peak named after him. Gauri Shankar has very different kind of holy associations. So the nature of meaning is very different. Then, can we say images or mental entities alone are meaning? Not so. That's also not satisfactory. Because a word like water, can we give an image of water that is reasonably steady? We can use the word water for a few drops. We can use it for a trickle. We can use it for a brook or stream. We can use it for an ocean. Samkhya pramana samsthana nirapeksha pravartate bindau cha samudaye cha vachaka saliladishu. So those are called in modern philosophy mass terms. And mass terms cannot have an image, but they have meaning. Every day we deal with words like water, but we don't say it doesn't have any meaning. But if you are asked to draw an image of water, we will not be able to do that. Our images will not be the same, and still will communicate with each other. So that's not satisfactory. And the final solution is, meaning is nothing but the word looked at from a different point of view. That is basically what Spota is. So this is what was being discussed in this verse 31. And that's where Bhartrihari, in the vritti that is traditionally ascribed to him, he says that the Sankhyas, he doesn't mention the Sankhyas, but the Sankhyas deal with Purusha and Prakriti relationship this way. That is, Purusha is engaged in the world, but not really just constrained in the world. Purusha remains still unaffected. And yoga, again, you will see a similarity with yoga, that yoga has this philosophy. Now, this sentence of the vritti, which I am not reading for want of time, was the crucial block in my historical reconstruction. That is, the passage was common to both the Yoga Bhashya and Bhartrihari. From other indications, I could get the feeling, although not the certainty, that Yoga Bhashya was earlier. But I could not prove it, as I said. So for 3 decades I was looking at it. And one possibility that did not occur to me, because we historians also get constrained in our ways of looking at the world, and we always have to ask ourselves, is my way of looking at the world the only way? Can I come out of the box that I create around myself? And it suddenly occurred to me that maybe the text of the Yoga Bhashya, because it is very old, has not come down to us in its original pure form, whatever form the author used for it. And that began to make sense, especially in recent times, after I had arrived at that conclusion only with respect to this passage. Philipp Maas is a German historian who is working at the University of Vienna, and he is preparing a critical edition of the Yoga Bhashya. And this is what he is finding with manuscripts also. The manuscripts, even for the later period, are much more disturbed than we would imagine. And then it occurred to me that this is proved by the evidence I had independently. And that particular sentence from Bhartrihari is found in the Yoga Bhashya at 3 different places. And in one place it's continuous, it's grammatically complete. In another place it occurs in an incomplete form, and so on. So the best explanation for this is that someone was reading the Yoga Bhashya, someone using a manuscript of Yoga Bhashya, and he or she, most probably he in older days, but he thought that this particular passage in the Yoga Bhashya was made more intelligible by what Bhartrihari had written in his vritti, and so wrote that passage in the margin somewhere as a sort of personal tool for understanding. And as frequently happens, what is written in the margin by the later copies is frequently incorporated into the main text. This is a common phenomenon in handwritten manuscripts. So that's what has happened. Then I found many other evidences. So in this way, philologically, we get a date for the Yoga Bhashya, that the Yoga Bhashya must be older than the time we ascribe to Bhartrihari. And to be cautious, we always say not later than. Actually, all these thinkers could be older. My research on the Saraswati River in the Veda or on other things, all that is pointing to an older chronology for Indian history. But we should not make unsystematic, unsubstantiated claims for older dating of Indian things. We should not write history from just a nationalistic point of view. We should have hardcore evidence. And I am gradually getting more and more evidence of that, whether it's Saraswati River or the inscriptions of Ashoka and so on. And generally, the trend is all these things are several centuries older than we take them to be. So Bharatara is right now dated by the fact that Dignaga, the Buddhist philosopher, borrowed from him. And if Dignaga is in the early 5th century AD, in the late second half of 5th century AD, then Bharatara must at least be in the first half of 5th century AD. So this is not later than dating, which we are obliged to do as responsible historians. But Bhartarari could be 1st century BC, as the tradition generally says. He could be even older than that. We have to keep these possibilities open. So we get a date for the Yoga Bhashya. Now, to summarize a lot of complex investigation, who is the author of the Yoga Bhashya? And for that, we have to bring in several strands together. This is Vachaspati's commentary, Tattva Vaisharadi, that's useful. Then another commentary which yoga students, yoga scholars do not generally discuss, but they should actually discuss more. It's called Yoga Shastra Vivarana. That's ascribed to Shankar, published I think around 1952 or something in the Madras series. And somehow only recently it's being worked on. And that commentary is not, I'm sure it's not written by the great Advaitin Shankaracharya, but some other Shankara, probably from the Payur Bhattatiri family in Kerala, sometime before the 14th century AD. But it preserves a lot of details of older yoga that were not known to Vachaspati, or that did not interest Vachaspati, to be fair to him. So we can tentatively put it there, not later than 14th century AD. And the thinker who wrote this commentary was a Samkhya philosopher called Vindhyavasin. So Vachaspati's famous verse at the beginning of his commentary, that Natva Patanjalim Rishim Veda Vyasena Bhashiti, that Veda Vyasena is actually a wrong reading for Vindhyavasena Bhashiti. Just its place of year and were changed, can mislead. And so modern scholars have been misled. How am I proposing an unsubstantiated emendation? I would generally not do that. But, or at least I would say it's a tentative emendation, something like that. But you do find a Jain scholar, Vadiraja, who in his Nyaya Vinishchaya Vivarana actually ascribes this and other passages to Vindhyavasin. So what we find in the Yoga Bhashya is ascribed by Vadiraja to Vindhyavasin. Vindhyavasin is a Sankhya scholar. So you can see that, and no other work of his is preserved, and many people have thought that his works are lost forever. And I would now say with great deal of confidence that the Yoga Bhashya is written by Vindhyavasa, and this reminds me of what was the kind of humorous situation that was taking place in the Western academic world in the 1960s in New York and Boston area, where I was spending a great deal of time. There is a kind of friendly tension between the Jews and the Christians. And at that time, because of the hippie generation and the effects of the Vietnam War and so on, some Christians were rediscovering Christianity. And they used to write graffiti on walls saying, "We found it." Okay, on subway stations, and "We found it." And the Jews responded with, "We never lost it." you will see that the similar thing with Vindhyavasan. Yes, we never had a work of it, but we never really lose it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.